This morning, I'm going to talk a little bit about the state of the world, what we see and what we're going to do. I'm going to be joined later by my friend Ralph Abraham and by Nora Bateson. We're going to have a trialogue about these topics. Now, I'm a person that believes there is a real world, even though I know there's a problem with the word real, and I know that my perception of that real world is my subjective perception. I'm aware that the map is not the territory, but I believe when we say the map is not the territory, we are acknowledging that there is a territory. I'm fairly certain the world continues when I die. My mother died recently and the world continued, therefore I'm pretty sure it will continue when I die. Whatever it is. And we also know that it is not an it, that it is a series of processes. Our perceptions of it are subjective. But there is something going on there, and that something, that process, that system of processes gave birth to us. I believe that there's a certain reciprocity that we have with nature from infancy, from the moment of life and the process of life. There's this reciprocity. We see nature, nature sees us. When I use the term nature, I realize there's many problems with that term, but nevertheless, I'm using it as a shorthand for what we see around us, the biophysical world that made us. So I'm saying these things because I think it's important for us to state our assumptions. I know that some of these things cannot be proven. I was trained in mathematics and physics. I'm aware that the mathematics I use cannot be proven, but I use it anyway, and the numbers still add up fairly well, and I can make predictions about the world. I was born on the prairies of the United States, Wyoming. Here I am, you can say, at an early age I was depleting the resources of the world. I believe what Kropotkin said, that nature is the first ethical teacher of humanity, and I also believe it's going to be our last teacher. And I know that as a child, that I began to learn lessons from nature before I ever asked any questions about it. And therefore, I have a personal experience that one can learn from the natural world without taking a question to it. And one example that I want to give is that when I was about 11 years old, the girl in that picture, by the way, was my sister, who was my second teacher. My siblings and I, walking in the woods near our home in Oklahoma, discovered a pond. We were fairly savvy young kids, and we figured there's fish in this pond. We just know it. Went home, got our fishing poles, came back, and sure enough, within a few hours, we caught these beautiful catfish. Biggest channel catfish we'd ever seen. We felt so proud of bringing a whole stringer of catfish home to our family, and just felt like real providers, and it felt so great. My mother cooked up a nice dinner. And so over the course of the summer, we continued to fish this pond and collect these catfish. Now, over the course of the summer, of course, the fish got smaller and smaller. Until one day, near the end of the summer, my brothers and I were at the pond fishing all day, and we caught nothing. Now, I remember as an 11-year-old boy standing on the edge of that pond, having had the realization, many realizations. I realized that we had fished out this pond. I also kind of knew that catfish are pretty resilient. If we left them alone, they'd come back. But that the bounty of nature is limited. We can get to that limit, a couple of 11-year-old boys. And in my own mind, I was able to, I could translate this experience into the world at large. And therefore, I was taught by these natural processes at a very early age that the world has limits, that these limits are real, and we can reach them, And when we reach those, our ability to harvest the bounty of the world is limited. Now, a question has come up over the weekend. It often comes up. I have spent most of my adult life in environmental work. Question often comes up is don't scare the people, fear, and this was a very good point that Eric brought up yesterday, that fear is not a good motivator unless it's real fear. If the house is on fire, it's a great motivator. But fear is not a great motivator for cultural change if it's not immediate and if people don't feel it. There's a lot of talk about hope. We need to engender hope. But I want to say something about hope. In the autumn time, when the air gets cold and the leaves are falling, it is not pessimism to point out that winter is coming. Thank you. And people ask me all the time, am I pessimistic or optimistic? I don't care. These are guesses about the future. I try to be realistic, even though I know there is a problem with this idea of realism. I try to read the data, and I try to act on what the world is telling me. So what is the state of the world? Let's think about it. Let's talk about it. The forest. Now something to keep in mind here is I'm going to talk about some of the quantitative states of the world. But remember the message from Gregory, that one of the problems we have that's an example of the way our thinking doesn't work the way nature works is we think in these quantitative terms and we are less able to think in pattern terms and qualitative terms. So let's keep both of these in mind. How are we doing with the forest? Well, there were once about 6 billion hectares of forest. There's now about 3. We're halfway through the world's forest. In land area, the forests are half gone. But if we take into account the actual standing timber and the quality of that standing timber, the forests are about 80% gone from their peak forest, Paleolithic forest. So all of our ingenuity, all of our efficiencies, all of our inventions, all of our cleverness has not stopped us from destroying 80% of the standing forest that we inherited when large-frame primates discovered fire and began marching around the world as if they owned the place. Now, remember there's qualitative impacts. This is a friend of mine, Naomi Cruz, Warrene Indian, indigenous person from Argentina. This is what's happening to her land. Why is her land being burned? Because Cargill and Monsanto and these other giant corporations are turning this forest land into land to grow soybeans. These soybeans get shipped to us. Now keep in mind, I've mentioned this before, it's an important point. We live in the 15% of the world that is using 85% of the resources. Everything we do, our universities, our way of life, our cars, our travel, our conferences, our nice lives depend on us using 85% of the world's resources and leaving the 85% of the people in the world to scramble around 15% of the resources. We must keep this in mind. As Vandana Shiva says, and I think this is very important for us to understand, the poor of the world are not poor because they're stupid, they're not poor because they don't understand cybernetics, they're not poor because they don't understand systems theory, they are not poor because they've left behind by industrialism, they are poor because they have been robbed. And they have been robbed by the rich, they've been robbed by the oligarchies throughout history. And that continues to this day. These are the Wichi people from Argentina. I was fortunate enough to work with them for a few years. We were actually able to preserve a small piece of land for them. But what's happening throughout the world is that we are foreclosing real sustainability. These people live sustainably in their forests. They can live, they're happy. They don't want our world. They want their forests. They can feed their children. They can live their lives. They're happy. They want to be left alone. But we are foreclosing these options by stealing their resources, and then these people end up in sweatshops and slums. This is an ash dump from a power plant in China. This is one ash dump from one power plant. The Western world has also exported our various industries. This is our ash dump because we're consuming these products. This is a young girl, 4 years old, dying from mercury poisoning in China. China has a serious environmental problem, but this is also our environmental problem again because we've exported this manufacturing to these parts of the world. But these impacts of toxins in our environment, these are happening all over the world. I know there's people in Canada and the U.S. and elsewhere suffering from mercury poisoning and other toxins. I was sitting with 3 other gentlemen at dinner last night. We were all talking about our children. We all had children who had learning disabilities, and we were all talking about the possibility of, well, do you think the toxins in the world have an impact on the fact that we have this spike in learning disabilities among our children, cancer spikes and so forth? We know it does, as well as we know anything. The data is telling us, yeah. So how about the marine mammals? How are we doing there? Well, when Greenpeace first started trying to save marine mammals, there were about 5% of the marine mammals left from the peak herds. We were saving the remnants of the whales and seals. And yet it was still considered a controversy. They have recovered somewhat slightly, so there's between 7 and 10% of the marine mammals and peak herds exist in the oceans today. Now, Greenpeace chose the whales and the seals because they were real issues and we really did want to save them for their own sake, not just for our sake. But we also chose them because we wanted to engender an ecology movement. And we thought that the whales and the seals and these animals could be a stand-in metaphor for ecology at large. That has not entirely worked. It partially worked, but we still have a long way to go to engender the ideas of ecology and living systems into our culture. And this process continues. The fish, we're about 90% through some fish species. The estimates vary from 60 to 90% through all the commercial species. Meantime, toxins in the soil, we're draining our aquifers, we're draining our lakes, we're damming our rivers, we're draining our rivers. Global warming is drying out our soils. We wash 28 billion tons of topsoil into the ocean every year, along with our toxins, create dead zones in the oceans. Deserts are growing at about 6 million hectares a year, while the forests shrink at about 16 million hectares per year. Now, the interesting thing to me is we talk about efficiencies, we talk about being more sustainable, but nothing in this process is actually resulting in any of these trends turning around. If I lived on a planet that was losing its forests at 16 million hectares per year and gaining desert at 6 million hectares per year, I would be worried. I do live on such a planet, and I am. I'm very concerned about this. I have children, I expect them to have children, and I care about how they live. We heard about the bees yesterday. We lose, in species in general, we lose a species right now about every 20 minutes. So while I'm up here speaking to you for an hour, on average we will lose about 3 more species, and this goes on night and day. So we're losing this diversity. One of the interesting things about the loss of the bees that we heard yesterday is it's been very difficult to pin this on a single reason, a single cause. And in fact, one of the reasons it's been difficult to pin this on a single cause is because it's not a single cause. It's a systemic situation. And the loss of these, we will discover most likely, have many causes and has been going on much longer than we thought. We're probably going to lose the coral. I honestly would say, looking at what's going on in the acidic oceans, we're going to lose most of the coral, if not all of the coral. This, of course, is a disaster because these areas, and again, remember, there's qualitative pattern impacts of these quantitative things. And the qualitative impact of losing the forest and the coral is that these are the engines of biological diversity. And this goes back to what Terry Deacon was talking about how living systems that endure real sustainability in nature, these systems create their own conditions for renewal. And as we undermine the diversity of the planet, we are undermining this ability for nature to renew itself and create. We don't know the role that each of these species plays in this great process. So the net effect, if I can sum this up, the net effect is that I honestly believe, and we heard this from Gregory when he was talking about money is fake. Debt is fake energy. Money in our system, in our world today, is created through debt. Debt is pretend energy. We also pretend that eventually we will create and aggregate enough energy that we can pay those debts off, but we never have done that. The G20 nations, supposedly the richest nations in the world, carry $70 trillion of debt. That debt has been growing for as long as modern economics has been in process. There's no sign that this debt is going to be reduced. Therefore, money is completely fake energy. Now, here's the other zinger. That $70 trillion of debt carried by the G20 nations, that is the collateral for $700 trillion worth of derivative markets. It's a Ponzi scheme. Our economic system is a Ponzi scheme, and we are destroying the real wealth in order to create this fake wealth, which is money, that when we hoard this money, people think they're getting rich, we're actually getting poorer. Now, I want to talk a little bit about habitat overshoot very briefly. And I know most of you understand this, so I can go through this very quickly. In 1944, the U.S. government took 29 reindeer to St. Matthew's Island for the soldiers during the war. The war ended, they didn't need the island, they left the reindeer there, 29 reindeer. The biologists who went back later figured that the island might have been able to sustain about 2,000 reindeer. So I have put that line there, capacity, that's the carrying capacity of that island, could have probably supported about 2,000 reindeer. They went back in the late 50s and found 1,350 reindeer, party. The reindeer were happy. They had no predators there. They were like the humans on the earth. No predators, lots of stuff to eat. They ran the place. Everything looked good to them. Everything kept looking good to them. Even when they shot past the capacity of the planet, or of the island. Now remember, when they shot past the capacity of that island, they were reducing that capacity. Because they were eating the grass. They were eating the life. They were able to grow to approximately 3 times the carrying capacity of that island. And this is an important point, because what it tells us is you can way overshoot your capacity before you crash. And all the way up that curve, the reindeer were assuming, perhaps not consciously, but they were carrying on as if there was no end and no limit, as we are on the planet today. Now we say they were dumb animals. What about humans? Here's the example from Easter Island. The biologists on that island assumed that the island could have sustained about 2,000 people. Interestingly enough, people overshot the planet or the island just like the reindeer. Interestingly enough, they overshot the island by approximately the same margin, 300%. So on that curve, on that sweeping growth curve, it looked to them all along that they were doing just fine. But once you are past the capacity of your habitat, your growth makes you poorer. And in the world today, I will maintain that our economic growth in our world today, every day we grow, we are poorer. We are now in that state, and it looks like we're doing fine. And the question is, Now there has been a theory that it wasn't really ecological overshoot that caused the people to collapse, but it was the arrival of the Europeans. But as you can see from this chart, the Europeans didn't arrive until the 16th century, or maybe even 17th century, I'm not sure, but the collapse had already happened. Here's the interesting thing about Easter Island. Most of the stone statues in Easter Island are half carved in the quarry. What does this tell us? They couldn't stop what they were doing, even as they cut down the last tree of all these things around the island. Most of the stone statues, over 400 stone statues, are still half carved. They're carving away, doop-de-doop-de-doo, wow, this is great, we're going to get, and meantime they're cutting down the last tree and they fished out their lagoon. And I maintain we're in a similar situation. We cannot appear to stop, we appear to not be able to stop what we're doing, even as we see this data. Now, can you overshoot a planet? These are some consumption curves. I don't have to explain it to you because most of you know how this works. This is between 1750 and now. This is our use of rivers, water, fertilizer, and so forth. But I want to draw your attention to paper consumption. Remember, computers were going to save paper? Yeah. Never happened. There's no point on this graph that indicates that computers ever saved any paper. We use 6 times as much paper as we used in 1950. In 1950, on planet Earth, we used about 50 million tons. Now we use about 300 million tons. Computers did not save paper. Economic efficiencies do not save resources. This is, in economics, this is called the rebound effect or the G-Bob's effect. We know that when we gain an efficiency with a resource, we use more of it. It's counterintuitive, but it's true. History tells us this is true. Here's some more curves. Coal, cement, copper, species loss, fish, all the things that we use. Now, we can aggregate these curves. You don't have to be a mathematician. You can practically eyeball it and know what this curve looks like. There it is. It's about 3.5% per year growth in consumption. Now, I don't have to explain all this doubling time to you because you understand that, but the net effect of this is right now, according to Bill Reese at the University of British Columbia and others, we are now at 50% overshoot. Now, if we were able to do something unprecedented in history and reduce our growth in consumption from 3.5% to 1%, would that save us if we all bought Priuses? Doesn't look like it. You know this area under the curve is real stuff. That's all the stuff we use. That's the copper, that's the metal, that's the molybdenum, that's the phosphates. If we continue even at an unprecedented reduction in growth of consumption in 70 years, we would be at 300% overshoot at the point at which, from historical evidence tells us, we would be crashing by that point. I call these the Wile E. Coyote scenarios. Now, the only way to survive, the only way to sustain oneself in a habitat is to consume below the capacity of that habitat. So what we need to be looking for is this soft landing into a lower consumption. And that lower consumption has to start with us because we're hogging 85% of the stuff. 15% of the people are hogging 85% of the stuff. Now I just want to quickly tell the story, and then I'm going to invite Ralph and Nora up here, and we're going to discuss the question, what the heck are we going to do? This is a friend of mine from British Columbia, Merv Wilkinson. He's a forester. Didn't learn forestry at the university, doesn't have any university degrees. He bought a piece of land in the 20s. He lived on this land for 70 years. He logged this land for 70 years. He made a living. He supplied building products to his community. The day he died, he had more standing timber in his forest than the day he bought it. I walked the land with him many times, and he would tell me about his techniques. He'd say, Rex, see those 3 Douglas fir trees over there? In a couple of years, I'm going to take out that little one, and I'm going to get the same growth in those other two that I'm now getting in 3. And then see that other one? I'm going to leave that for about 6 or 7 years, and then I'm going to take that out for a saw log. That's going to be a beautiful saw log. He knew his trees individually. He knew the growth rate of his forest, and one day he turned around to me, and after explaining all these techniques that he used, he said, "It's really simple. I just cut below my growth rate. If you're growing 3.5 meters per hectare per year, and you cut 3.25 meters per hectare per year, your forest is growing. This is not rocket science. Sustainability is not that hard. What's hard is we don't want to give up our privileged position. Actual sustainability is fairly simple. Consume below the capacity of your habitat." Okay, I'm going to leave, this is real sustainability. An example of real sustainability, of consuming, of harvesting the bounty of nature without destroying the land you're living on. Okay, I'd like to invite Ralph and Nora up, and we have decided to do it this way because we wanted to have more of a dialogue. We call this a trialogue, and the question we are asking is this: 20 years or 40 years of the environmental movement, actually 50 years since the publication of Silent Spring. I've been involved in the environmental movement almost that long, about 45 years. And I've done everything I know how to do. I've worked with colleagues who are doing everything they know how to do. And I know all of you care and are probably doing everything you know how to do. But we have to look in the mirror and we have to face reality. We are not winning. All of these curves that are troubling are increasing and becoming worse. So we have to ask ourselves, what are we going to do? Are we just going to continue on like the reindeer? Or are we smarter than the reindeer? Are we smarter than the people on Easter Island? And if so, let's prove it. And then the question is how? And I think some of the ideas that, and this is our double bind, because our economic situation, our economic system requires us to continue to grow, continues to erode the planet. If we stop growing, we will create social chaos and even more poverty. Now, part of the answer, of course, is that we have to share. That's not rocket science either, but it's something that our culture appears not to want to do. Okay, Ralph Abraham, mathematician, chaos theorist, and he has some very interesting ideas about paradigm shifts, and you all know Nora Bateson, and we're going to discuss these issues. Thank you. Yeah. So I would like to ask Ralph to kind of introduce this, and maybe Ralph, you could sort of tell us from your perspective of having studied paradigm shifts in culture. Are there ways? Are there ways that we can start to think about the things we need to do to change?
Well, I have no idea what we can do to start to change. All I know is that from the mathematical point of view, complex systems, such as we live in, they change in a saltatory fashion. We have tipping points, bifurcations. We don't always know exactly what to do to precipitate one. And if we had a mathematical model for the whole enchilada, we could probably think of something clever. So mathematics of complex systems is not predictive. And all we know is that a salvation, a bifurcation, is a possibility. So I have to ask you what you think we could do to precipitate a bifurcation. See, we're in the chapel, and we as a choir, we 3, there was growth, and then there were approaching disaster. And we know that we have to approach the problem on the global systems level, and so what to do. So I'd like to ask Nora, what do you think Gregory would do?
Good morning. Well, he's not here. But recently I was in Italy, and I was working with a group of people who are doing a kind of very unique therapy, rehabilitation therapy for people who have experienced some sort of paralysis or aneurysm. So people who've had strokes or who have been in accidents or who are in terminal pain. In other words, people who are in the experience of having a bifurcation, a breakdown in the circuitry of the way that their body can function. And so what's interesting about this therapy is that it is based on the difference that makes a difference and how that functions in terms of reconstituting the ability to integrate ways of knowing. And I was thinking about this morning and thinking, actually I wonder if what we're not experiencing is some sort of cultural paralysis, where the circuitry of what we're experiencing we're unable to reconstitute. And it'll take me 2 seconds. But one of the things that they do as an example of an exercise is, Rex, hold up your hand for a second. So the patient, say this is a wood block in the shape of a hand. The patient, for example, is asked to take their working hand and to run it around the edges of the thing, whatever the thing is. And then asked, oh wait, I missed something. First, the question is, what is it going to feel like? What will you experience when you experience this thing when you run your finger around? So there's a hypothesis. Okay, this is important. Then the patient runs their finger around, and the question is, what did you experience? What's the difference? Then the question is, how did you know? Where did your body receive that information? And of course, the first thing we want to say is in our finger. Okay, but actually, the finger didn't do the measuring. The finger didn't do the math there. That happened in the shoulder and the elbow. And it also happens in the memory. It happens in all functions of our system. The more dialogue and description that comes from the ways in which this thing is known, the more the integration begins to happen. At the end of this, I was working with a young boy who was half paralyzed, and he had I'm not sure what the technical term is, but when they claw up like this, and he was trying to reach for a glass of water. And what was interesting about what he did is that in order to give the information to the paralyzed hand, his other hand was on the table, and what I watched him doing was studying the relationships, the memories, the edges, the textures, the entire realm of knowing in this hand to give this hand the information. It took him 45 minutes, and his focus was not over here, it was here. So by looking at the relationships that were healthy, that were intact, and studying them at multiple levels, he began to reconstitute an integration of knowing. So I don't know if that's helpful, but I thought it was an interesting metaphor.
Well, I'll just briefly, I'll say it's an interesting metaphor to me, because when I think of let's look at the examples of healthy relationship with the natural world, I do see them. I see them in some of these indigenous communities that are living simply and living within the capacity of their habitats. I see it within the scrub jay out my window. they seem to be living within the capacity of their habitat. So this is why I say it's a good idea to apprentice ourselves to nature with all of the challenges of our language and to understand what that means. But nevertheless, there are examples in the living world of things that do indeed sustain themselves, or sustain them, not themselves, because we know the species pass away, but sustain the process of life. Right.
Well, we have, unlike the reindeer, we have our history books. And I wonder if instead of looking at those examples in history where cultures had a good relationship with nature, we instead look at these much more numerous examples of disastrous relationships with nature and think of that as the exploration, like going around this hand, so that we can learn from these negative experiences. So I look to you, Rex, as my mentor in the field of activism, and all the things you've tried, and all the things that haven't worked. Especially if you look, like you write about cultural change. We look at world cultural history and prehistory from the get-go. Are there examples where people tried, who learned from their failures, and then tried to precipitate a cultural change and succeeded? Or is it actually hopeless for us to try that?
There actually are examples, and those of you who've read Jared Diamond's Collapse might be familiar with some of the examples. Unfortunately, or instructively, the examples of successfully reversing habitat overshoot are very rare, far outnumbered by examples of collapse. And but the common thread presented by Jared Diamond and others of civilizations that have awakened to the fact that they are overshooting their habitat, and that the increased complexity of their technologies will not save them. Very important point. A person that worth investigating in this regard is Joseph Tainter, who's written about the collapse of complex civilizations. And what happens, and this was a point that was brought up on day one, is that in a growth curve, most of the benefit happens early in that growth curve, whether it's a new technology or whatever it is. And then as the growth curve continues in the natural world, the marginal benefits of growth shrink, and the costs of growth increase to the point where your costs eventually exceed the benefits. So we may, so now we're considering shooting little sulfate umbrellas up into the sky to block this nasty sun that's heating up the earth. But when we hear these geoengineering gurus talk about this stuff, they never do the math. They never follow through the supply chain, the cost, the energy cost, the material cost of keeping these sulfate umbrellas up in the sky. And so their ideas will create more complexity. But what Joseph Tainter and others have determined is that there does come a point in the evolution of civilization where increased complexity makes you poorer. I talked about that before. Growth actually makes us poorer. So, to get to Ralph's question, there are examples of civilizations, and there's a good example in Mesopotamia, of a localized civilization that realized it had overshot its habitat, realized that increased complexity was not going to save it, and they simplified. Now here's the theme that runs through all these successful retreats from overshoot. Simplifying. Not becoming more complex, but becoming more simple and learning to live simpler lives, simpler beings. And this goes to Arlen Ness's comment that we can live much richer, happier, more pleasant, more exciting, more interesting lives with a lot less stuff.
And I think what's interesting about that is that we call it simplifying. There's always this dichotomy between complexity and simplicity. But that in fact what you're doing is in a sense respecting the complexity of the relationships that are existing.
Yes.
And in that declaration of respect, there is a simplification of life, but actually it's an honoring of the complexity.
Yes, indeed.
And I think that's what happens with the patients as they begin to notice exactly how many forms of knowing and ways of experiencing these outlines or these different textures, these possibilities between memory and experience and physical and is it here, is it there, is that there is this, by the way, this is working. They're having a lot of success with that treatment. But it is complex. And that circuitry, the cybernetic circuitry of our experience and the way that we get through the day from the moment our eyes blink and our metabolism picks up to the moment we close them at the end of the day, the minute particulars of the things we say, the scripts we are living within, matter. Are we reifying? Or are we shifting? Are we playing with it? Are we beginning? And I really do want to use the word play, because I think Ray brought this up yesterday, and Eric responded to it, that responding in fear is not necessarily going to be a healthy response. And the kind of creativity that comes out of abstracted fear. And you got to wonder about the reindeer. They just carried on because they couldn't do abstracted fear. They couldn't handle the idea as an abstract that they might run out of stuff. So how do we deal with that information in a way that it can be just information that we can respond to, like you said, signals that we can interpret?
Well, we don't know that the reindeer can't reach a state of abstract fear. We don't actually know that. There might have been a clever reindeer going, whoa man, this life is disappearing. I'm not sure we're going to have any next year, or something like that, not of course in language like we use, but certainly there were probably, and very likely, at least some human beings on Easter Island. I sort of imagine a little group of teenagers who met out under the last tree going, does anybody besides me think our parents are crazy? And there were probably people on Easter Island thinking, this is nuts, but like us, they were not yet able to turn their culture around. And so this is where the question comes, is what can we do? Here we are, we're educated, we're smart, we have access to resources. If anybody's going to sort of engender some order of magnitude change to start thinking in terms of patterns instead of quantities, it's got to be us or our colleagues, or perhaps in concert with some of these indigenous people. I don't know.
Well, we do have these clever reindeer, and the thing is that their predictions haven't mattered. The overall reindeer culture keeps on racing towards the edge of the cliff, and then they did have the decline as you showed. So I think we haven't really approached to the question of what can you do, and if you can do anything. So my idea of what you can do has been, this is another failed strategy, that world cultural history is a ship going in a bad direction and it had a rudder, and the rudder is called the educational system. So the problem with this is that the clever reindeer are not able to move the rudder. Somebody else is controlling the rudder. And nevertheless, these bifurcations have happened. For example, the Roman Catholic hierarchy tried to prevent the scientific revolution by torturing and killing a lot of people, and it did happen anyway. So if there is a rudder, maybe it's the educational system, and the wrong people have the hand on the rudder. But maybe the bifurcation in the educational system is underway now through the smartphone revolution. That while the university or academic educational system news system based on cyberspace and autonomous network classification is taking over. And if that were the case, it might help or not, depending on the actions that we take in guiding this new technology of education.
Greg, we used to talk about genotypic versus somatic change. There's a chapter in Steps about it, and one of the things that strikes me about that, genotypic being at the level of structure and somatic being at the level of habit, that what we're talking about is a kind of flexibility, and what he referred to as the economics of flexibility, which is also a flexibility of economics. And that before things generally, although occasionally things genotypically change right off the hop, before things generally change genotypically, they change at the somatic level. And that basically that occurs for a while, and then the change happens at the structure level. So I just wanted to add that into the stew of the shift, because it is in the level of what we say and do and behave, and the languaging that we use from day to day are those tiny little pinpricks into a cybernetic system that is going to respond in all sorts of ways. So yes, education, yes, medicine, yes, politics, yes, economics, yes, yes, yes. At all these levels, we have to begin that changing.
Does that make sense from your point of view, from a mathematical and paradigm shift point of view? Does that make sense that these changes can happen simultaneously or sequentially or whatever at many, many levels, and then at some point, is that what a bifurcation is?
Well, yes, but in our experience with artificial complex systems, we see that the bifurcation moment is the only moment in which there's some alternative futures are possible. And it could be that at these moments, our intention actually helps to determine which of the possible outcomes will be the successful one. So even if you, let us say, try to stop the harvesting of whales over and over again for 40 years, it still might be, in the right moment, the right thing to do.
Yeah. Do that. We have about 10 minutes, and if somebody has some ideas, can you run the mic? And we'll use this mic up here. You can use that mic, and let's carry on. Start with Lois, the elder. One of the elders. We're all kind of like.
I wanted to bring this into our own backyard.
Yes.
I take it out of the global a minute because I believe in starting with my new particulars. After Gregory died, after I wrapped up some things, I moved over to the East Coast to try to help my two old parents cross the bar. At that time, I thought they were pretty old. They were in their late 80s. I don't feel so old now. But I learned a lot from those two people. My father did pass on in a couple of years, but my little mom lived to be 100. Now, one of the things that I watched these two old people do was simplify. And where they simplified was in censoring the input. I mean, they began to see less people. They went to less concerts. They cut the stimulus that was coming in because the energy to deal with it was lessening as part of the aging process. So it was a matter of resorting the equations to lessen what came in so they didn't have to put out more. And so, and all the gurus around the world are always saying that the more baggage you carry on your back, the harder the journey. And I think this is something that we can all in our own backyards begin to do in downsizing and finding out how little we actually need to get along. Now, Nora and I went through this when we made various trips to India and found that living in one room for 4 or 5 weeks with only a suitcase, no furniture, this is at an ashram somewhere in Andhra Pradesh, we got along fine. And we came back to a house that was packed with several generations of antiques, and they're lovely, they're beautiful, but do we really need all of that? And we have to pay insurance on it, we have to worry about it. That's just simplifying.
Thank you, Laura.
May I state my ideas in short?
Yes, there's mine.
Thank you.
I have 3 ideas which have come to mind in your discussion. One is that, there's this need to reduce our consumption, that is to say, the quantity of our consumption. But as an alternative view, we should be raising the quality of our consumption. In other words, it's not necessary for everything to decline or to contract. You could, in fact, have an economy which is based on increase in quality. And a good example of that, for example, is Moore's Law, where in digital equipment, for example, you get much more out of a small piece of silicon at much lower cost by increasing the quality of that mechanism that you're designing, or that chip that you're designing. The other couple of ideas that I'd like to share is there are examples of sustainable communities within our own community. For example, the Amish. They have done this process of simplification. They have decided what are their boundaries or their constraints, if you like, and they have incorporated in their manner of living. And of course, that's the most difficult thing to change, is the manner of living. So in the case of the Amish, it's a tradition that's passed on through families, from parents to children and so on. And they have some wonderful mechanisms whereby they can make changes or correct things and to create a large space for their communities. For example, by allowing their children to go out and experience the world, and then come back and become part of that community. The third idea I'd like to bounce off you is the mechanism of migrations that occur. Quite often, prior to the collapse of a community or a civilization, you'll see a mass migration of people going from that community. They saw the light, they know what's wrong, they know in some cases that it's inevitable what's going to happen, and they move away and start their own community, often understanding the mistakes made in the past, incorporating it in their manner of living for a more sustainable society. Of course, it's much more difficult to do today because there isn't any new world to go to. But I'm still thinking, that's going to be a feature of the collapse of our civilization. You're going to have incredible mass migrations as people start running. The thing about fear, too, is that it creates an impulse to either run or fight. But where are you going to run to today? It's not possible. So therefore, fear is in fact something that's not very useful. Anyway, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Nora, yeah, go ahead. Just wait a second.
One of the ways in which somatic change is useful is that it's reversible. If you change things at the structural level, it's hard to change them back. If we want to. But I think the reason I'm bringing this up in response to what you just said is that I think that one of the most interesting sort of models for approaching right now is improvisation. We're at a moment when we have to do things we've never done before, think in ways we've never thought before, go places we've never gone before, and what that requires is a kind of listening, a kind of response, and that is collaborative. It requires trust. It's going to be based on a lot of what was said yesterday in terms of what Graham called a loving institution. That the context is the level at which these things move, and that what we need to be able to do is start trying things, experiment with even the patterns of our conversation during the day. and so on. Patterns of the way that we teach as teachers, of the way that we are as parents, of the way that we are as spouses. That beginning to play with the roles, because as Gregory said, that's a half-assed relationship, begins to change what the relationships are, and that is a qualitative shift.
It's kind of quiet.
Hi. Easter Island pattern.
Is that on?
Because what's this? Sorry.
We're at 10 o'clock, so we can...
Oh, yeah.
Okay, the Easter Island pattern, in which over half of the stones on Easter Island were still in progress, suggests to me that they were actually accelerating their rate of production of statues.
Yes.
Which suggests to me that perhaps producing statues was their cultural response to their declining environment, that a stronger appeal to their gods would save them, and therefore accelerated their collapse, in the same way as technological solutions to what we're doing is our appeal to our gods to prevent our collapse, but is indeed accelerating it. And Ralph, you suggested that education was a large part of the answer, but I'm not sure that we have time ahead of us for Thomas Kuhn's process of this shift of generations for the educational system to catch up, for the paradigms to shift. But teenagers still, in some sense, represent the leading edge of the educational system, and the metaphor I'd like to make is with the whole view of smoking in American culture. In the 1950s, you were a negligent hostess if you were not able to offer your guests cigarettes. And if you were a guest in someone's home and you did not accept the offer of cigarettes, you needed to offer a polite explanation for why you did not smoke. That has completely changed in the matter of a couple of decades. And in my own family, the way that it changed was because me and my siblings ganged up on our parents as teenagers and said, "We want you to stop smoking, we want you to live longer." We, as teenagers, were able to, because we had more malleable minds, we were able to accept new input in a totally new paradigm and then apply that paradigm to our older generation. And I think it's the combination of those two forces are two places where we do have some room to actually act.
We have time for two more questions. I think we're going to take Eric and Ray, who are both leaving. So, Eric?
I have one sentence I'm going to say. One possible solution. The performance of anti-communications in daily life. It's an invitation.
Okay, so we have a serious time crunch and lots of people that want to talk. So
one thing is that we will have a half-an-hour coffee break after we hear from Deborah Hammond, who I want to hear in full, and it's her time now. How about this? We listen to Deborah's presentation. Maybe she'll take some questions at the end. We'll have a half hour after that. We can continue informally or more formally here with questions. Is that fair enough?
it is for everybody who's actually got their bags zipped and either in their room or in here. So I hope that.
And I'm happy to share my question time if you guys want to come up after my talk.
Thank you, Deborah.
Okay.
Have a conversation. I mean, I think mine will kind of weave into some of the themes you addressed.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
Thank you very much.